Feedback. Does it even work? And if it does, why don't more leaders give feedback? That's a good question. Today we're going to talk about it. And I'm going to spill some tea. I'm also going to talk to you about some of the biggest mistakes I've made when it comes to feedback. When we talk about feedback today, we're going to discuss what that looks like at different levels, coming from different levels of leadership. And at the end, I'm going to give you some practical suggestions on what you can and should do. So for the last, I'd say 10 to 15 years of corporate culture, we've been living in an era of feedback, where we're hearing that employees want feedback to help them grow and develop. And a lot of companies have been training their managers and leaders on how to give feedback and encouraging people to give peer feedback as well. So why aren't we giving more feedback? Because we're also hearing that people feel like they are not getting enough feedback that helps them grow. They don't know what they're doing right, they don't know what they're doing wrong, and they don't know how to fix it. It's really interesting to me because, as I've mentioned before, I started working in the late 90s and early 2000s, and it was definitely not a feedback culture back then. You would get comments from people that I think was intended to be feedback, but was more, I'd say, character assessments than actual actionable feedback. There was never anything you can do about it. So as we've discussed before, good feedback is actionable. Someone knows what to do with the feedback they're getting. And so most companies have been training their management to give feedback that is actionable. And so some companies have specific feedback methods and systems that they use to make sure that people are giving feedback in a consistent way that is constructive, meaning helpful, and that people know what to do with that feedback. It all sounds great, but we're still seeing a lot of statistics, as I mentioned, that people just feel like they're not getting the kind of feedback that actually helps them grow. So why the disconnect? Why is this still happening? Well, there's a few different reasons for that. One is that I don't know that we're spending enough time training people on how to hear feedback. So keep that in mind. I think that sometimes people are getting feedback and they don't actually know that they're getting feedback. Does that mean it's good feedback or that's well delivered? No, but that's not the point of today's conversation. So let's assume going into this conversation today that people are attempting to give feedback and they're attempting to give it in a structured and meaningful way, and that the listener is more or less prepared to hear that feedback in this structured and constructive way. Let's make that as a working agreement for this video. The other thing that you may have noticed if you deal with a lot of senior leaders, and this is something I want to talk about first because I think it's a really interesting symptom of this disconnect, is that all of these companies are saying that people should be giving feedback and training people on how to do it. And yet, if you've worked with any senior leaders, you'll notice they don't do it. They don't use the system that the company has implemented for feedback, meaning they don't give it a lot of times in the framework that people are trained to use. And sometimes they're just not even trying to give feedback at all. Why is that? Like, if we know from a management and an organizational perspective that feedback is so valuable and so wanted by employees, why don't more leaders, and especially senior leaders, give this kind of feedback? This is an interesting one. I think this problem looks different at different levels. I was in a management training course last year or something at the company I was working at, and the facilitator posed the question, why don't more people give feedback? And he meant at the manager, middle management, and peer levels, why people don't give feedback. And again, this supports what we're hearing from people, that they're not getting enough feedback at all levels. So let's just acknowledge that and move on. So at the manager, director, sometimes senior director level and peer level, the reason people aren't giving feedback, and this is what came up in the course, is that they're afraid of people's reactions. So they're afraid to hurt people's feelings, or they don't want someone to be angry with them. It's more about how I personally am impacting this other person at those levels. And that can be a real constraint. And the whole purpose of creating methodology around feedback is to give this expectation so that people aren't offended by feedback, and also to give a framework so that you know you're doing it in a correct way, and the other person is then encouraged to be receptive to the feedback. And then the other thing that you see happen in a lot of companies, and this is what's happened at a lot of companies I've worked at that are genuinely focused on developing people and support these frameworks for giving feedback, is that you have to jump through so many hoops to give difficult feedback. Meaning, if I want to give somebody on my project team feedback, and it's kind of hard corrective feedback at this point, I've given them the soft feedback and it's time for some more firm feedback or feedback that they may not take well, what happens behind the scenes is that people then go to that person's manager, they socialize it with their own leadership. Sometimes they even run the feedback by HR. And there's a lot of steps you take to get air cover in order to give the feedback in such a way that if the person reacts, there's a support structure around them, like with their people manager and potentially their mentor, to support and help reinforce the feedback and help them process it, but also to cover your butt. And the reason you do need to cover your butt, and I don't often talk about CYA, so you know if I'm bringing it up, it's serious, is because because it's not just about the other person reacting in the moment to the feedback or being angry with you personally. A lot of times people who get feedback that they don't like actually retaliate in some ways. And they start in their head telling themselves stories about why you're giving them this difficult feedback. I have seen this happen so many times to other people, to me, where the person receiving the feedback starts, we call it making up stories, but it's not lying. It's just your brain trying to protect your ego, basically, where people then start saying, oh, they're just giving me this feedback because they don't like me, or this other thing happened, and so they're giving me this feedback to be punitive. And so a lot of times when people aren't receptive to feedback, it's a form of ego protection. And ego protection is very dangerous because people will do anything to survive and they feel like their survival is threatened. It sounds crazy, but it's true. If you're giving somebody hard feedback and it really touches on something kind of core to them, and you may not know it does. It may actually seem fairly simple to you and not even kind of scary feedback, but it may trigger them. And when it does, they do go into ego protection mode. And a lot of people, when they go into this ego protection mode, they lash out. So we have this problem where a lot of peers, managers, and director level people don't want to give feedback because they're afraid of people reacting to them in the moment and having, frankly, an uncomfortable conversation. Nobody likes uncomfortable conversations, but even more so if it's more serious feedback, they know they have to do so much CYA going into the conversation because unfortunately, what we've seen over and over and over again is that people get so reactive to feedback that triggers them in some way, and you can't always predict when that's going to happen. And unfortunately, and this is where we're then going to talk about the next level of leadership, more senior leaders have seen this happen so many times, they've just decided it's not worth it. It's not worth the risk to them. It's not worth the noise that happens because there's a lot of noise if somebody becomes disgruntled. So if you've given someone feedback and you've been in this situation, this probably sounds very familiar, where all your intentions are good, you do your best to give somebody constructive feedback, but in some way it triggers them and they start lashing out and they become disgruntled. It becomes often an HR issue, unfortunately, or at the very least, multiple management people need to get involved. In the moment, this can be super uncomfortable, but if you're looking at a senior leader who has decades and decades behind them in their career, and you think about how many times they've seen this happen, they may not even make this choice consciously, but unconsciously, they have overall decided the juice isn't worth the squeeze. They are not going to stick their neck out to develop people by giving them hard feedback when they know that there is such a huge chance that someone might retaliate in ways that aren't direct. If it's direct retaliation, that's pretty obvious. But a lot of times it's indirect and it turns into gossip and it turns into, like I said, disgruntled employees and unhappy people. And the person who received the feedback isn't accepting responsibility for maybe they have something to develop, or maybe they need to go process this with somebody who's going to help them process the difficult feedback in an objective way. I'm not saying anybody's right or wrong in this situation, by the way. I'm not. I'm just saying that there's a certain interpersonal dynamic that tends to happen with humans in the workplace, and feedback can genuinely trigger this fight or flight response in some employees. And a lot of times, depending on their work style, that can turn into them internalizing things, never telling somebody they're unhappy, and them just not being able to process it in a healthy way. So when you look at senior leaders and you notice they don't give the kind of feedback that a lot of companies are encouraging people to give, it's because they have at some point inside themselves, consciously or subconsciously or even unconsciously, decided that it's not worth it to them. They know it's dangerous and they just rather not do it. So the more people move up in leadership, the more they tend to give vague or ambiguous statements. I think you've noticed this. They tend to not say concrete things sometimes unless they're at the very top level, like a CEO, where then they do say concrete things. But anything in between where it's senior leadership but not like the top C level, they know their best course of action is to play it safe and not say anything that can ever be held against them. Well, that sucks because that means that they're not giving feedback in a way you expect, but it doesn't mean that they're not developing people. And so let's go back to my point about knowing how to listen for feedback, because the other thing that if you are already on a leadership track, you may be keyed into this, but if you're trying to be on a leadership track or you've been struggling in some way, this might be something that you're missing, which is that the more senior and experienced a leader is, the more they're actually giving you subtle feedback. They will say something that sounds interesting, like there might be a part of you that's like, did they just say something? Did I just miss that? Like, are they trying to tell me something? Yes, most of the time they are. And they're just saying it very carefully. And this is actually a safer approach from them because they are attempting to develop you, but they're more senior, so they should be developing more senior people who can hear these more subtle messages. So a lot of times senior leaders, even if they're in the room with more junior employees, are still messaging things in this less direct way. They're giving you indirect and subtle feedback. And if you are in a place in your development where you know how to listen for subtle feedback, then you're prepared for the message they're giving you. And then you can actually hear and interpret what they're trying to say. Or even to the point of recognizing they're trying to tell you something, even if you're not sure exactly what it is, you can then follow up with them and just say, hey, you raised this interesting point and I'm just not sure I understand it. Would you mind clarifying or telling me more about that? Because I actually really love this idea and I just want to make sure I'm getting it. So if you're ever in a position with a more senior leader and you think that they are trying to tell you something subtly and you're genuinely receptive to it, do a little follow-up, because a lot of times they will then open up and tell you the thing that they're observing or the thing that they think about you. So if you've ever wondered, are my senior leaders nudging me? Are they doing things behind the scenes? If they're invested in you, they absolutely are. And they know you're ready for that kind of support based on how you respond and react to it. If you're curious, if you're interested, then they know it's worth their time to be more open. Now, other senior leaders may be more open with a direct mentee, someone where they have an agreed relationship where they will be more direct. They tend to feel more comfortable opening up because it's more limited in scope. It's just one or two people, and there's kind of a contract in place about being more receptive and being more open to giving feedback. So this is actually really important, because if you're in a leadership track, I want you to understand how the leaders above you are operating so that you can do a better job listening to the messages they're giving you, but also so that you understand that as you're moving through this leadership chain, the way you're giving feedback should change, because these are real issues that they're concerned about, but also because the people around you are used to hearing it that way. So if you are giving a director feedback, he or she is used to hearing that feedback in a more subtle way from their senior leadership. So the way your communication changes as you progress through the levels is an indicator to other people that you are maturing in your career. So think about it. You, as you're progressing, need to be listening differently to the people above and around you. And then you also need to be messaging things this way, because frankly, they're right to be concerned about being too direct. And also they've learned to tailor their communication for how much they've progressed. So that's one thing to think about. There's a very good reason why senior leaders don't give feedback the way you're trained to give feedback. And that means that if they ask you for feedback and you're too direct with them, that also tells them something. So yes, it gets complicated. It's fine though. Just remember that as you progress, how you give feedback should change. That's a big point. That's my first point, is that you will often hear that you're supposed to be giving feedback and doing it a certain way, and then you'll look at senior leaders and think they're not doing it, or recognizing they are doing it just in a different way than you've been trained to do it. And you're going to have to accept that. That is the reality. I wish they would be more open about it, but again, their expectation is that you, as you're maturing, have the situational awareness to understand it and the leadership experience to observe it and model it. So that's my first point. Now, is that directly tied into feedback not working? In that leaders have adapted their behaviors because feedback can be dangerous, and also that sometimes people aren't hearing feedback correctly because they're not tuned into more subtle feedback. So that's point number one. Now on to the trickier part. Let's say you're in middle management or you're entering middle management, and suddenly you're like, yeah, I have noticed people are fussy about feedback, or I am scared to give people feedback that I'm supposed to. I am going to say, if you are in management, yes, you have to give your people feedback, whether you think it works or not. And if it's challenging feedback, make sure you're doing the CYA we talked about and make sure that you're documenting it. Because if you have a performance issue with this employee and you haven't given them this feedback, unfortunately, you're going to have to do some things to correct that. And it's going to cost you more of your time, which is kind of precious. So keep that in mind. One thing I forgot to mention is that there was that, I can't remember which executive it was. I think it was Nokia, who doesn't have one-on-ones with his employees. And that cracked me up, because he has just completely decided to opt out of feedback at all. And I love it, to be honest. When I heard that he wasn't doing one-on-ones with his employees, I'm like, oh my gosh, like I would be exhausted by all the one-on-ones I used to have to do. And yes, that is part of the territory. And unfortunately, as middle managers, you can't just skip that because it's more important. But what freedom. But also, that means he's not giving his employees that much feedback. He's not sitting down with them every week. Feedback, feedback, feedback. You know, it can be draining, and it can be especially draining navigating the emotional minefield of how people react to that feedback. So, all right, so let's say that you are entering or you're firmly in management or middle management, and you are genuinely like, okay, Gabby, all that aside, does it work? Sometimes. I'm just going to be really blunt here. You cannot change a leopard's spots, and you cannot teach a fish how to ride a bicycle. So I am not going to tease this till the end. I'm just going to cut to the chase and say you cannot fundamentally change another person, and you cannot fundamentally encourage another person to change themselves. But it's not always your job to decide that person's a leopard or a fish. Do you see what I'm saying? It's your job to give them feedback and observe their behaviors. So if they're in a job that requires them to be a fish and they're just not a fish, there's no amount of feedback you can give them that will change how they do that. So I'm going to give an example here. If you have a project manager, just going to say this, I haven't many times in my life found myself managing a lot of project managers. And unfortunately, if you have project managers who can't plan, you can show them how to plan, you can lead them to Microsoft Project, but if they can't plan, they need to either have an effective workaround for that, or else they may never be a fully functional project manager. And there's no amount of you giving them feedback about them not having a project plan or how crappy their project plan is that's going to change that. If they're not a planner, they're not going to be able to do that part of the job. I've seen some people who can work around that by bringing the team together and having the team plan, and they can facilitate that. That's great. That's a workaround. I've also seen a lot of project managers who can't even facilitate other people planning. So that means that you're going to be in a situation where you're always going to be giving them feedback about something they fundamentally can't do. The hard part is most people you're working with aren't that self-aware. They don't always know that they're not good at planning, or they just haven't accepted that about themselves. The worst part is if they suspect they're not great at that and you give them feedback, that can be one of those situations I talked about where you're triggering an insecurity they have, and they tend to get emotional about that. And that's when they'll lash out or internalize it or start gossiping, all that unhealthy stuff, right? So just really look at your employees and ask yourself, are they fundamentally capable of doing what I'm asking them to do? They may not be. And so you have to decide, is that acceptable or not? But the mistake I've made, and this is me being vulnerable and transparent here, the mistake I've made is just to continue down the path of giving feedback when, even if they've seemed willing and they're super nice and I genuinely care about them and I want to see this work, fundamentally, if they can't do the thing you're asking them to do, all you're doing is driving them and yourself crazy by continuing to ask them to do it. It doesn't work. That's when feedback doesn't work, is if you're trying to turn someone into someone else or ask someone to do something that they are just fundamentally not capable of doing. And let me repeat, often they don't know, or they're not self-aware enough to acknowledge it or honest enough to tell you. It could be any of those things, and you don't always know. But I've worked with so many people who tell me they can do something, and it turns out they've never done it and they cannot do it. Or who tell me they want to learn, but unfortunately they just struggle with it, and then they get frustrated by my continued attempts to teach them. And so what I've seen is that more mature leaders who are just frankly a little bit more pragmatic than myself recognize this earlier than I do, and they just decide to make a change with that person. Because if someone can't do a fundamental part of their job, like I said, you have to decide if that's okay. And that may mean that you have to coach them out, or if you can't coach them out, you may need to replace them. And that is sad and it's unfortunate. But what you can't do is just continue beating them over the head with feedback, because that's worse in some ways. That hurts them worse. That hurts their identity and their ego. And all it does is make them more and more upset with you. This is really important. And so I hope that you guys are really thinking hard about what I'm saying, which is that if you're in a leadership position and you are trying to give feedback to coach someone into a certain set of behaviors and it's not working, you can't just keep doing it. It will end up hurting you and them. That's unfortunate, but it's actually less bad and less painful to take a different approach if the feedback isn't working. That's actually the biggest thing to think about when you're trying to figure out if feedback is working with somebody. You have to try it. They're your employee. Unless they flat out told you they can't do the thing, or they don't want to do the thing, or they're not interested in the thing, that's different. Then you know. Personally, this one's hard for me. We all have our blind spots. My own blind spot is that if something's easy for me, I think that it's attainable for other people. That's not always true. So if you're the kind of leader where things come easy to you, you may have to think about that for a moment. That just because something's easy for you, it doesn't mean that it's within reach for someone else. It doesn't mean they can do that thing. Not just that it doesn't come easy for them, but it may just not be in their wheelhouse, and that's okay. So what do you do with that? This is where I highly recommend playing to people's strengths, identifying what they're good at and magnifying their strengths, and not worrying so much about what they're not good at or what they're struggling with, because people will show you who they are. People will show you what they're good at. And so I have worked with people who are not good at being on time, or who are not good at remembering what happened in a previous meeting, or who are not good at planning. These are all things that are very important to me, by the way. But I've made that working relationship work by finding out what are they good at, and can I create a role for them that makes sense and plays to their strengths where they're still really contributing. This is the right answer most of the time, especially if you have a tenured employee, someone who's been there for a while, somebody who's worth the investment that you want to continue making in them. Play to their strengths. You can't change who they are, and you can't turn them into somebody that they aren't. And if the job requires that, fundamentally, that may be the wrong job for them, but it doesn't mean they don't have a place in your organization. And when you're playing to somebody's strengths, that's when feedback does work, because you can help them get better at something they're already good at. You can help them get good at something that they're interested in and kind of have an aptitude for, but just haven't experienced before. So these are the situations in which feedback does work. If somebody is magnifying somebody's strengths, because you can help them fine-tune those strengths and those skills and become even better at them. It feels good for you, it feels good for them, and it's a win for the company. Now, on the lines of does feedback work, I had a really interesting conversation with an executive a few months ago, and he asked me, we were talking about leadership styles, and I was telling him that sometimes I struggle with this. Sometimes I just keep pushing on people and I think that they're capable of learning something, and it just doesn't seem to work out or go where I expect it to. And he reminded me of the skill-will matrix. And you've heard me mention this before, but I'm going to talk about it again in this context because it's really important, and this is where, frankly, it's the most important. The skill-will matrix means where are they on a plot of how much they are willing to learn or do something, and having some sort of skill or aptitude in that area. This touches a little bit on, are they fundamentally capable of doing that thing? But this one's a little bit more subtle, because they may be fundamentally capable of doing it at a basic level. They can at least get a project plan out, but they're never going to get better at getting a project plan out because they're maxed out on that skill level. Or maybe they're not interested at getting better at project planning. That's the will. So when you're looking at, is feedback going to work with this person, or why isn't feedback working with this person? And it's more subtle. They have that foundational capability, but they're just not improving on that foundation. That's when you have to pull out the skill-will matrix and ask, are they willing to learn? Are they willing to try? Do they seem interested in this at all? So will is the combination of interest and determination in this scenario. And then with that, do they have the ability to increase that skill? Because some people don't. Some people really max out at a level. And again, that's a little different than what we talked about not having the capability. It's there, but it's only there to a certain extent. Past that point, they may not ever get better. And an example is somebody who is decent enough at time management that they can show up to meetings on time, but they are not good enough at time management that they would juggle five different number one priorities and be so rigorous about their time management that they can make it work. Basically, can they get to an advanced level at it? And don't get me started on skill and competency matrices, because y'all know I love those. But if you look at a skill and competency matrix, you have to see where are they and are they topped out? Whether that skill is client management, communication, project planning, development, being a scrum master, etc. People max out at a certain point. Same thing's true of leadership. Sometimes people top out at a certain level because they can't make that jump in some way. Either they can't do the strategic thinking, or they can't do the subtle and indirect feedback that I was talking about earlier, or frankly, they don't have the situational awareness to hear what's going on around them, the self-awareness to do the advanced and extreme self-development to get to very senior leadership levels. Sometimes people top out at their skill level. And so when you're looking at your employees, you have to ask yourself, again, do they have the willingness to continue this journey and improve this? And do they have the skill necessary to continue to grow? And if the answer is no, then feedback's not going to work. It's just not going to work in that situation. And you're going to be back to beating your head against a wall. But it's going to be even harder because it's more subtle than if they just didn't have the capability at all. And this is a trap, like I said, that I've found myself in a few times where I can see, hey, they're at least decently good at this thing. Of course they can improve it. And they say they're willing to do it. But remember, they may say they're willing to do it. It doesn't mean that they are. I have an example of somebody who worked for me who just told me he didn't know much about agile project management. And I'm like, great, did you take this class? Did you do this? Did you go to this seminar? Did you read this book? And he's like, oh no, I don't learn well that way. Well, the more excuses he had, because I talked to him about it a few times, and he just had excuse after excuse, and it turns out, yeah, no, he didn't actually want to learn. He was not willing to learn. He was just saying that because he was trying to give himself an out from an ego defense position. And again, you'll notice that the more you manage and lead people is that there's a lot of ego protection that goes on, like I mentioned, and it shows up in a few different ways. So people who are constantly saying that, oh, I can't do that because I've never had an opportunity, or nobody ever taught me. Those are all excuses. It means it wasn't important enough to them for them to go create that opportunity or find ways to go learn it. And so if you're not in a leadership position and you're hearing me say this, you're like, whoa, Gabby, that is harsh, girl. I'm really, really sorry. You may not see it that way, but that is what it looks like to leadership. And there's probably a nugget of truth to that, really. And so sometimes you have to ask yourself, you may want to be in a certain chair. Are you willing to do what it takes to get there? You may want a certain title or a certain role. Are you willing to do the work it takes to get there and the work it takes to stay there? A lot of times the answer is no. I talk about that in my, are you sure you want that promotion video? So quick plug. Go watch that video if you haven't watched it. But yeah, so does feedback work? The answer is sometimes. Sometimes feedback works. And it works in a situation where you're magnifying somebody's strengths. It works in a situation where someone is willing to do the work and has the determination and is motivated to do so. And it works if you are increasing their skills in a way that they have capacity for, meaning skill capacity. It works if they have the ability to grow those skills, and not everybody does, and not everybody knows it. And if you're a direct person like me and maybe have a touch of the autism like I do, it could be very tempting because you'd like to tell people the truth and you see a lot of things. It might be tempting to tell them, hey, I feel like you've topped out on this, but you can't say that directly. You can encourage them to find other interests if their skill and will don't match the thing that they're trying to tell you they want to do. It is kinder to nudge them in a different direction that plays better to their strengths. It's kinder to encourage them to focus on their strengths. And if they ask you for the blunt truth, still deliver that blunt truth with kindness. But if you have an employee or a coworker or a business partner that you're working with that keeps signing up for work and not delivering and keeps saying they want feedback, but they can't seem to change their behaviors, then something's missing. And it might be the skill, it might be the will, it might be both. And fundamentally, at the end of the day, you also are getting paid to do a job. And while there is an expectation that you as a leader are helping to grow and develop people, remember, there is an equal responsibility on them, if not greater, for their own development and their own progress. And if they're not willing to do that part of it, at some point you do have to walk away. And this is the reason that I haven't mentioned yet. This is the other reason that senior leaders often don't give this kind of feedback, is it is so much work to think about the feedback you need to give and how to message it so it's going to land well with the person. It's a lot of work. And the more people you're responsible for, frankly, the more this can suck up your time. And a lot of senior leaders are aware this isn't the best use of their time anymore. They are no longer in a position where they need to work this hard to develop people. That's why they have middle management under them. So a lot of this burden falls on managers, directors, and sometimes senior directors. And above that level, people are just stepping away from it. And they'll have a couple people, less than a handful, that they actually genuinely invest in. And so think about where you are in that hierarchy and think about, A, what you're willing to do to rise in that hierarchy, but also what is appropriate from you in terms of being the person that's developing people. And I have to admit, that's the other biggest mistake I've made that I wanted to highlight, which is that I have grown past needing to focus that hard on developing that many people. And yet I kept hearing that I was supposed to, and so I kept trying to do it in ways where I was trying to develop people where the gap was just too wide. Either we couldn't relate to each other or my expectations were more than they could deliver. It's just really hard to develop that many people that deeply at that scale. And so give yourself some grace. If you're sitting here going, man, I do not work this hard to give people feedback, give yourself grace. Depending on how many people you're responsible for, it's frankly untenable. And so just do your best. Tell people some key things they need to know. So here's the summary. As always, I'm going to say just make your best effort, but be okay scaling back and make sure you're investing your time as a leader where it's going to be most valuable, which is playing to people's strengths, coaching people who want to be coached, giving feedback where it's appropriate for you to be the person giving the feedback, making sure you are tailoring it in a way that they can receive it, but being mindful of your respective levels, meaning sometimes you may need to be more indirect for various reasons. And definitely do CYA when you're giving hard feedback. Make sure you've got the documentation, make sure you've got the air cover, because unfortunately, people will lash out if you're giving them feedback that makes them feel threatened, even if you're doing it for their benefit. So yeah, feedback is tricky, and you have my sympathy no matter which end of this conversation you've been on, because it's not easy. It's not easy to hear hard feedback. It's not easy to give it. And I have a reputation for being just a diehard feedback fanatic. And so I think a lot of people watching this might be surprised for me to say there's a lot of times where feedback doesn't work. And I've learned that the hard way. And I often had to ask myself, why am I so invested in investing in other people when they are not receptive to it? And when I'm seeing the leaders above me not modeling that behavior, not doing the same thing. And that's when I had to understand that maybe I wasn't supposed to be giving so much feedback anymore. And maybe I was giving feedback to the wrong people. And maybe I needed to model my behavior more like the senior leaders above me who had just decided that, it wasn't worth the risk. So yeah, food for thought. I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on this. Let me know what you think about feedback, when it works, when it doesn't. And if you've had some really good or really bad experiences with feedback. I think part of the reason I keep doing it is because that feeling of being told that I'm supposed to, or people telling me that they really want my feedback and want my help developing them, even if their behavior's not changing, and it tells me the opposite of what they're saying. But also because when you're a leader, it feels so good when you know that you've positively impacted someone's career, when you know that you've lifted them up, or you've helped them with an unlock, or you've helped them with a key moment in their career. Feedback even helps people understand things that they haven't understood about themselves and about their own growth. It feels really good when you can give somebody a special moment in their career and you know that you've helped them. And to me, right, wrong, or indifferent, that is why I've continued to give feedback when maybe somebody else wouldn't. And so my takeaway for myself personally is to just keep trusting my gut. I'm the kind of person where if I think it's the right thing to do, I'm going to keep doing the right thing. And just because it doesn't work out the way I intended doesn't mean it wasn't worth the effort to try. So do with that what you will. Does feedback work? If I had to put a number on it, I'd say 15 to 25% of the time, even when you do it perfectly. But I'm still there for the 15 to 25% of the time. All right, everybody. Thanks so much for spending time with me today. I really appreciate it. I hope you liked this episode. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below, and good luck out there.